So this is a video to explain the necessary information and background for reading the Copernicus text, which we'll read this week. Let us start off. So we're going to talk about three different figures and their cosmological models in this video. So first of all, let's begin with Aristotle. As you'll see in this course, Aristotle is mentioned quite frequently. Aristotle's philosophy, in brief, was the philosophy that dominated the Western tradition from, most throughout the entire medieval period, or what is called the Middle Ages. The reason for this is that a large part of Plato's philosophy had been lost. Aristotle's philosophy too had been lost, but it was reintroduced to the West through the Arab scholars. And when it did so, it became integrated with Catholic philosophy. The Catholics essentially took the doctrines of the Church and they sought to fuse them with Aristotle. Aristotle is an amazing, incredibly complicated, intricate philosopher with something to say on just about every topic. He provided the foundations for a lot of, for philosophy, for biology, for cosmology, for logic. He essentially, building on Plato and Socrates, invented logic. And all of those things were adopted by the Christian Church as tools for articulating religious doctrines. So it did turn out, however, that there were some inconsistencies between Aristotle. Aristotle was not Christian, so there were some inconsistencies between his teachings and those of the Church. And in those cases, the Church held Aristotle to be in error and often tried to show that the conclusions that he drew that were contrary to Scripture, he had made some kind of mistake. Right? Now, the basis or the use of that for the Catholic Church was quite extensive. The philosophy of Aristotle became the philosophy that was taught in the schools. And it was also used in what is called apologetics, or in the writings that were intended to try to persuade non-Christians of the truth of the Christian religion. The basic idea here was Aristotle as a philosopher and as a person who just thought and worked on the reason itself and the way what reason tells us about the world, that this provided a kind of articulation, a science, a very well articulated doctrine about the natural world as it could be understood by the human mind. And of course, the Catholic Church too believed that reason to some extent could tell us about the world, right? God gave us reason. Perhaps God revealed other things that he didn't reveal through reason, but what he reveals through reason, what he teaches us through experience, that too is true for the most part. And importantly, sometimes, as Aristotle himself thought, thinking with natural reason, leaving aside revelation, you could come to certain views about even God. For instance, that there is a God, that God exists. Aristotle had a proof that God exists. His God was sometimes called the unmoved mover. We'll see why when we talk about his cosmology. Sometimes it's characterized as thought thinking itself. It's a very philosophical God in Aristotle. Aristotle's God is brought in as an explanation in the cosmos to explain why things operate and move in the ways that they do, and also to explain the intelligibility or the ability of the mind to grasp things that are in the world and to understand them. So the Christian Church used those ideas. Imagine if you're trying to persuade someone of the Christian religion, the first thing you might want to persuade them of is that there is a God, or that there is only one God, for instance. And if you can use natural reason, logic, arguments, that's much more persuasive in the beginning than simply opening up a book like the Bible or the Quran and saying, look, you must believe this. So first persuade them that there is a God, and then persuade them that it is the particular God that speaks to you in your revelation and in your books. So this was, for this reason, Aristotle was, or this is how Aristotle was used throughout the medieval period by the Christian Church. As I said, there were some things that Aristotle held that the Church believed were inconsistent with Christian doctrine. One of those was the eternity of the world. Aristotle believed that the world existed eternally, that natural kinds existed eternally. Hence, there was no moment of creation. So his God was not a creator God. We'll see this is quite important in the shift in cosmological models, right? In the models of how the universe works and how to understand it when we come to Copernicus. Because Copernicus, as a Christian, often uses the argument that as God created the world for us or for our contemplation, he would have created it in a way that is beautiful, orderly, designed, and so on. And he uses this as an argument against previous cosmological models, which he found disordered, irregular, ugly, and so on. So notice in an Aristotelian world, you couldn't make that kind of an argument because God didn't create the world. So you can't bring in you can't reason about what God would have created if he created it for us if it was not created. So there were inconsistencies there. Now, as far as the Copernicus text and what we need to understand, as I said, Aristotle originally, his book on the heavens is one of the most fundamental ancient texts of cosmology, right? Aristotle, in having set out his own views of the cosmos, he employed a certain separation within his own work in doing so, namely a separation between what is called natural philosophy and the realm of what we would now call applied mathematics. And his view was that when you are doing physics, what we would call physics, when you are giving true natural explanations for phenomena, like rocks falling, planets moving, and so on, you have to give a certain kind of reason for that. And that reason goes back to the nature of the bodies and the types of things involved. So let me give an example. If you want to explain why a rock falls in Aristotle's world, in his intellectual world, then you have to look to the material from which rocks are made, which he had as many did, the idea of the four elements, right? One of which is earth. And once you see that rock is made of earth, and you know additionally that earth moves in a straight line towards the center of the universe, which is at the center of the earth in the geocentric model of Aristotle, then you know why rocks fall. They fall because everything that is earth moves in a downward direction towards the center of the earth, right? And rock is an example of a piece of earth. When you want to know why fire goes upward, then you also look to what is the fire made of. It's made of fire, which is one of the elements, and the characteristic natural place, as Aristotle would say, that fire proceeds towards is towards the heavens. And so the explanation as to why fire moves up is because it is fire. It is the nature of fire to move in that way. That doesn't seem very explanatory, and that's one of the perennial objections that are brought against the Aristotelian model of physics, is that these explanations don't appear to be very enlightening. However, they can be enlightening, and you might say that we have very similar ideas today, right? When you ask why do rocks fall down, we say because they are made of matter and gravity pulls them towards other pieces of matter. And then when we ask, well, why does gravity pull things towards one piece of matter towards another piece of matter? Then our answer is, well, that's what gravity does. it's the nature of gravity to do such a thing. Now, we might have one or two more levels of explanation in higher physics, but eventually you come to a point where the answer is always, that's just how it happens. That's how it happens, and that's why these things that are examples of other things operate in the way they do. So the point is not to really explain why fire goes up. Fire going up is one of the basic descriptions in Aristotle's theory that explains why other things that are fire-like also go up. So these things are used to explain more complex phenomena. Why do I fall when I trip? Because I am made also of earth, right? Not just because earth falls, but because I am primarily earth, although I have air and other elements in me as well. So that's going back to the original point there. Aristotle's physics is such that the only proper kinds of explanations are explanations that appeal to the natures of physical bodies. Those are called natural reasons. And he separated that off entirely from what we would call applied mathematics. In mathematical theories, of course, you create a mathematical model for what is going on, and you calculate if a certain force is impressed or so on. Aristotle didn't have this notion of forces. But you calculate something, right? And for Aristotle, mathematical reasons were not proper reasons. So for him, the calculation of a consequence of certain kinds of actions using a mathematical model was not a proper explanation because it was not using the proper kinds of explanatory grounds. For this reason, he separated off what we call astronomy. It was a part of applied mathematics. From physics, which is part of natural philosophy. Natural philosophy gives real explanations of things as they truly are, while astronomy only calculates and uses those calculations to predict the places that we will find planets and stars in the sky at various periods in the year. So it's purely mathematics is applied here in a purely descriptive fashion. And even that description does not need to correspond in any way to the actual physical reality. Now, today, if you kind of flash forward to modern physics, we use mathematical models in perhaps almost every area of physics. If you think of fundamental physics, there's nothing but mathematical models. And there is no question for us that mathematical models describe the nature of reality, that they give real explanations, and that if you calculate something to be a certain way, then that calculation itself is an explanation, a natural explanation. But this was not Aristotle's worldview. And this led to a separation between astronomy and physics. Now, let's look just a little bit at the model, the cosmological model of Aristotle. So here, take a moment and become familiar with this picture. It's in Latin, so that might be a little bit difficult, but I will explain what is going on here. So in the middle here, you see something that's kind of complicated. Looks like maybe there are plants. This is the Earth, of course, because the Aristotelian model of the cosmos is geocentric. It has the sun, or the Earth in the middle. Next is, of course, the moon, lunae, right, or lunae, and then Mercury, and then Venus, you can see, and then Solus. Solus, of course, is Latin for sun. So the sun rotates, it's among the planets, and it rotates around the Earth. Jovis, Jupiter, Saturni, Saturn, and that is it, because that is all you can potentially see with the naked eye, and they didn't have telescopes in those days, although they did have fairly accurate measurements of the placements and angles at which the planets appear in the sky at different times. Then you have some other circles, it seems, and then you have this outer circle, the empyrean, right? Coelum empyreum. This is the highest part of the universe. And it says here, primum mobile, first, moved thing, right? So here you see the stars, right? This is the sphere of the fixed stars. In the Aristotelian model and in all the models up till Copernicus, essentially the stars all exist in one plane or one sphere, as marks on that sphere or in some way related to that sphere, fixed in that sphere. That's why it was called the sphere of fixed stars. And what people noticed, and if you go outside today, tonight, any day of the week, you'll notice, and you watch the stars a little bit, you'll notice they don't appear to move relative to one another at all. That's kind of striking. You might think about why that is. Give that a thought for a moment. Because they are all moving at very high speeds at various times relative to one another. But in all the past history that people were aware of in Aristotle's time, no major motions of the stars relative to one another had ever been observed. And also, if you notice, they seem to rotate around us all at the same speed very regularly, as if they were all contained in one enormous sphere. Now, in the Aristotelian model, there is a fundamental difference, and you can see it here in this picture, right? Below, this looks very kind of chaotic. This looks like fire, and that is what it is, right? Because fire goes towards the outside. It goes away from the center of the universe, whereas Earth settles towards the center of the universe. This line is absolutely fundamental in the model, because below this, it's called the lunarary, under the moon, sublunarary sphere, right? This whole area is where is occupied by the four elements, and so the physics that takes place is governed by the four elements, and the four elements have there's some particular characteristics of their physical motions. For instance, the four elements always move in straight lines. This was a kind of motion that the ancients thought was particularly imperfect, because it doesn't go on forever. Like, they thought that moving in circles was a much more perfect form of motion because it never comes to an end, right? It has, in a way, its end in itself, which is to continue its own motion. Whereas everything in the sublunarary sphere, the rock, once it would eventually reach the center of the universe, would come to a standstill. It's gone to its end. So also fire, when it got to the edge of the sublunarary sphere, would stop moving because it had reached its end, and it moves in a straight line. So everything down here is changing constantly, according to Aristotle, and we'll see why, because things are always being moved out of their natural places by a motion of this outer sphere. One further aspect of the physics of this lower area, which is that obviously it's the nature of Earth to move towards the center of the Earth, and that is called its natural motion. But when I lift it with my hand, for instance, away from the center of the Earth, this is called violent motion, because it, in a way, violates the nature of the thing in question. It prevents it from doing what it would naturally do. So although the movement of my hand may be a natural motion, the motion of the rock in my hand is a violent one, because if I let go of the rock and leave it to itself, it would move towards the center of the Earth. Okay. So getting back to this lower sphere, it's occupied, as I said, by the four elements. But above it, the superlunarary sphere, right, the sphere above the moon, is occupied by a fifth element, sometimes called quintessence. But its character, the character of that material, is that it moves perpetually in a circular motion. And all the planets are made of this material. There is nothing changing on these planets. There can be no seismic activity or volcanoes or plants growing, because none of the four elements are there and they do not undergo that kind of change. From the moon itself is made of this special material. It is unchanging. It moves perpetually in a circle and it is more perfect. Everything down here is messy and corrupting, because eventually, for instance, my body falls apart because my elements go back mix with the rest of the elements and follow their natural places. But above this, that does not happen. And you move, if you are at the center of the Aristotelian universe, you are kind of in the lowest, most moving, corrupt, messy place. And as you move outwardly, you move towards, particularly at this boundary line, towards what is more perfect, more lasting, more eternal. Essentially, these things are eternal and perfect. Until you reach the stars, and then you reach some intermediary spheres, and then you finally meet the prima mobile, right? The first moved sphere, right? Now, the prima mobile is the outer sphere of the universe. There's nothing like anything in here outside here. And how it's prima mobile because it's the first moved. So the idea is that all motion in the universe is kind of communicated downwardly. So this first prima mobile moves the next sphere by moving, moves this one and moves the next one, and that one moves the next one, and so on and so forth until this outer area is moved, and this communicates motion into the center of the universe. Right? Now you might ask yourself, how does this prima mobile move? Well, because there is one further being in Aristotle's universe, which is the unmoved mover, right? So he's not the first moved, he is the first mover, and he's unmoved because nothing moves the Aristotelian God, right? He moves intrinsically. And so the Aristotelian God is introduced in this respect as an explanation for where change and motion comes from in the universe. He essentially communicates to his motion to the outer sphere, and it gets communicated downwardly. And this kind of communication is not what you expect in Aristotle. It's done through the fact that there is a kind of the rest of this universe kind of imitates God in his motion. They love God, and that love, he often explains the unmoved moving power of God as similar to the unmoved moving power of love for an object. So if you love me and you are drawn to me and moved towards me, I do not move you. If I were to move you, I would have to move myself, right? But I am not moved. I kind of stay within myself, and you move towards me because of my intrinsic nature, is that towards which something moves or is something that is intrinsically loved. So that's the Aristotelian universe. Two things to notice there. It's very structured, and in a certain sense it has a nice order to it. Secondly, and that's in terms of its physical structure. Secondly, there's some value judgment going on already in the Aristotelian universe. So this stuff is more corrupt, less eternal, less like God. Things, as you move outwardly, you move towards the more eternal, the more perfect, the more godlike. You could see perhaps why this would be attractive to the Christian church, right? Because they too held things like, just think about it, the body, physical things to be more corrupting, to be lower. Of course, they ally the body with sin and desire and these kinds of things, whereas, and one should strive towards a less bodily, more godly existence in the Christian church. So there is some natural overlap in the value system behind these two. Okay, so that's the Aristotelian model of the universe. Now, you might notice, think about this for a moment, that it's unlikely that this model is going to be of very much use for astronomy itself, meaning for that practice that uses mathematical models to actually predict where certain planets will be in the sky at certain times. This might this is built largely on natural reasons from Aristotle's natural philosophy, right? Not upon, he didn't look to the data of astronomers of the time, which they took down data just like they do today, in order to fix and determine whether this model could be true or not. So there was, this is where we introduce our second figure. Well, no, we can introduce him here already, yes. Ptolemy. Claudius Ptolemy, you can read the Wikipedia page for yourself, lived from AD 100 to 170. Greek mathematician, astronomer, geographer, astrologer. Pretty much everyone who was an astronomer, even up through Copernicus's time, were also astrologers. Ptolemy is important because he was the monument of the astronomical sciences through the entire medieval period. He wrote several important books, one of which was called the Almagest. What he did was he both created a model for the universe that fit the empirical data, and he collected the most precise empirical data that could be gathered by the naked eye. So he built enormous instruments, and of course he lived in Egypt, where you have some amazingly clear skies over the deserts and so on. And so he took incredibly precise measurements, and in fact his data remained, even past Copernicus, the data that all astronomers used in building their models. Even Copernicus didn't have any telescopes; they were not invented yet. He was not even really an empirical astronomer at all, Copernicus. So he simply used the measurements of Ptolemy as well. This is how fundamental Ptolemy was. Now, Ptolemy built his own model. Ptolemy's model is built, one could explain it by saying he built it trying to account for the actual motions of the planets in the skies. And here is one of the main problems, the key problems that you'll hear about. This is the problem of retrograde motion. Now, if you are out, you can, throughout the year, here even in Beirut, as bad as the air is, you can still see the skies, and you can see a few stars. You can see Jupiter. You can see some of the planets with your naked eye. In fact, if you go out at night and you can use your phone, and you can get one of these applications to help you find the planets and stars very easily. And you find the plane that's called the ecliptic. This is the plane that slices through the Earth and through the sky, and through which most of the planets more or less travel. Right? That's called the ecliptic. And if you look if you're on AUB campus and you are facing the water, the ecliptic is essentially over the water, parallel with the water. So it passes more or less overhead here where I am, in parallel with the Corniche. And if you follow that and you look there, you will see the brightest object in the sky. That is Jupiter. So go out some night and look at it. Now, if you were looking, as the ancients did, every night, laying up, looking at the stars, you would notice that some of those stars do move relative to the others. Just a few, though, right? Those were called the planets, because planet means movers. It means things that move in the sky. That's the basic meaning of a planet. It's a star that moves around. Because if you look at Jupiter, it just looks like an incredibly bright star. But if you watch it over a period of time, not only does it move, but it moves in some very strange ways. And here I'm going to play a video that exhibits this kind of strange motion, which was called retrograde motion. And this is a video of the actual motion of a planet during 2016 of Mars. And you can see how it moves through the sky. Here we go. So let's pause for a second. You'll see this is just Another planet, I believe, moving, and these are the constellations drawn out. This is how the ancients kept track of planets, because see, none of these stars seem to they don't move relative to one another. They move in a and each of these is taken over a period of time, right? Not necessarily the same night, right? So here we go, and this is Mars moving. Stop for a second. You notice the moon keeps going. This is what I called the planet. This plane is called the ecliptic. You see other stars move in this same way. The moon moves in the same plane, essentially. Mars moves in this plane. Okay, let's keep watching. So what in the world is Mars doing? You might not have expected this. It's moving through our sky, and then suddenly it turns around and starts going back in the other direction. This is because it's progressing, and then it's regressing. This is called retrograde motion. And now it turns again and continues on its path. And after a period, it will do the same motion once again and again and again and again. Okay, so there is no way, you can think about it, there really is no way to explain that in the Aristotelian model. Right? There are just these spheres that move each other. The outer sphere moves at a constant rate. How in the world do you explain the spheres where these other planets are located as moving backwards at some point? Not possible. So Ptolemy, he didn't have to worry because he had the freedom of not doing natural philosophy. He didn't have to worry at all about explaining how quintessence or the fifth element could move backwards and so on. So he simply built a mathematical model. He had his data and he fit his model to the data. And he came up with a very clever way of building his model. All the way through Copernicus, you'll see that one of the predominant ideas of astronomy was that the universe, however it is constructed, must be constructed out of circles. The main reason given for this was that circles are continuous and perfect, and the universe repeats its motions over and over for eternity, regularly. And the only way that can be done is if eventually, somewhere, it is built of circles. So not surprisingly, if you open up a mechanical watch today, you will not find anything but generally circular gears, right? That connection between the parts being circular and the overall motion being regular was just a very powerful idea for the ancients. Something they didn't really question. So Ptolemy wanted to build his model out of circles, and yet he needed to get this peculiar retrograde motion into his model. So this is what he did. First of all, he removed the Earth. So the Ptolemaic model, sometimes you'll hear it referred to as the geocentric model. That is, however, strictly incorrect. Now, geocentric means Earth in the center. The better description of the Ptolemaic model is the eccentric model. So the Earth is still generally in the center, but it's slightly outside. It's eccentric, right? It's outside the center. This opposite, so here's the center, and then the exact mirror image of where the Earth would be was called the equant. Now, notice this is all built of circles. So we have the Earth, and then we have a planet in general on a circle, right? It moves on a circle, and that circle is called the deferent. You can see down here, the deferent. You'll need to know this terminology to read the Copernicus text, so keep this in mind. The deferent, and then there's another circle on that circle, and that is called an epicycle. And Ptolemy's method was he would use the data for the location of the planet in Earth's sky, and he would try to fit that data to a circle, and if it didn't fit to a circle, he would simply add another circle. And if that didn't fit, he would add a circle on that circle. Right? So you could have kind of an epicycle. And if that circle didn't work, he would add a circle on that circle. And so the general method was keep adding circles until the data fits. Now, most of the data fit to the degree of accuracy of his measurements with the addition of only one cycle or one or two cycles. So famously, you'll hear that there are epicycles in the Ptolemaic model, and you might wonder how would Ptolemy explain why it moves on this circle, the second circle? And the answer is he didn't care. He had his mathematical model that he built, and he was not involved in Aristotelian natural philosophy, so he didn't have to have an explanation. There was no presumption that this is how the planets were actually moving. And this gave him the freedom to put as many circles as he liked. Later it was, or maybe even at the time, I don't know, but it can be shown that with this method you can fit pretty much any data to a precise degree of accuracy. So this model was kind of a universal method one could use in building astronomical models. And it worked incredibly well and was employed for the next so many thousand years. The only reason people really looked for alternative explanations is because they still wanted to relate this to how the bodies in the sky actually moved. And so they felt that this was very inconsistent with Aristotelian natural philosophy. If you were to assume this is how the planet moves, this is hard to explain for a number of reasons. One, let me just give one, is the moon moves on one circle, right, around the Earth. And if the Earth is not in the center, then the moon, you may have to follow this closely, this reasoning. If the Earth is not in the center of the moon's orbit, and yet, as is true, the moon appears to orbit around us at a constant speed, then it must be the case that the moon, for instance out here, speeds up. And here it slows down. And even Copernicus, this is one of his major reasons for disliking this model, he believed that based upon Aristotelian natural philosophy, bodies moving in circles should move at constant rates. But they do not. Okay. So this is the model. Now let's see how this looks in action to see how this might solve the problem of retrograde motion. So now we'll watch this other video. So here we have all the planets. Let me pause this and make it larger. So here we have all the planets with their various Ptolemaic motions. You see here the deferent, the epicycle, right? And then the motion that's being drawn as it moves in the sky. Okay, so there was a little skip there in the video, I know, but let's watch it for just one more moment. So I think you get the idea here. Now, imagine you're on the Earth and you're looking out into this plane. Now you have an explanation of retrograde motion, right? Because at this point, moving on that circle, the planet, from your point of view, begins to move backwards and then forwards. Backwards, and now again forwards, right? This might remind you of these childhood toys called spirographs. It's essentially the same idea. It's circles in circles, making all these patterns. And essentially what the Aristotelian the Ptolemaic method of building models was just arbitrarily picking. Of course, he had an infinite number of possible spirograph circles to put within one another, and just seeing whether you could find one that fit the data that was actually taken by astronomers. And as I said, this prevailed. It worked. It predicted the seasons and the places where the planets ended up at various times of the year to an incredible degree of accuracy. All right. But during the entire history of the Ptolemaic model, astronomers were troubled by, and you'll see this in the Copernicus text, he'll mention the various troubles he has based upon the attempt to think of that model as being a model of how the planets really move in the sky. And seeing that, to him, it violated a lot of the principles of Aristotle. This might be surprising. This should be surprising to you, because Copernicus is seen as the bringing forward the new modern science, right? The father of modern science. And yet the reasoning that he has for why the Ptolemaic model must be replaced with the heliocentric or sun-centered model of the universe is largely built upon reasons and worries that go back to Aristotle himself. So this is quite, history is always much more complicated than you might think. And it wasn't based, as many people may say, or you might read, it was not based upon Copernicus's use of new empirical data. He didn't have any new empirical data. He was not that kind of a scientist. He was more of a theoretical scientist. So here he is, Copernicus, Nicholas Copernicus. His major work, which you are reading, is on the revolutions of the heavenly spheres. Here it's translated on the revolutions of the celestial spheres. He lived from 1473 to 1543. He died on his deathbed. The book was presented to him, the first copies of On the Revolutions of the Heavenly Spheres. So he spent a great part of his life working on this book and perfecting it, and not publishing it. And then eventually, at the very end of his life, many people came to him, including Protestant religious figures, Catholics, friends of his, and they encouraged him to publish it before he died, and he agreed. And as it was being printed, I believe he had a stroke. I could check that, but he was definitely not in his right self. He was shown there the book, and then he died. When the book was on its way to being fully printed, and he was there in his deathbed, his very good friend, who you will see in the text, his name was Osiander, but you'll see his name at the beginning of the text that you're reading. Osiander was quite worried about the reception of the book, and so he put on a preface. And we'll talk in class about what kind of troubles that preface created, because he did not sign the preface. And so many people, even up until Galileo's time, people did not know whether the preface was written by Copernicus or not, and many assumed so. In fact, the Catholic Church consulted Galileo for his opinion as to whether Copernicus had written the preface. And Galileo said definitely not. If you study the work in detail, you'll see that the person who wrote the preface could not be the same person. And this eventually led to the condemnation of Copernicus's book, and then eventually the condemnation of Galileo himself when it became clear that Galileo sided with Copernicus. Okay, so now the Copernican model, you know, I'm sure plenty about, but you might keep in mind a few issues. The Copernican model only applies to what Copernicus thought was the universe, which is centered on our sun. So in his universe, the center is the sun. We no longer believe that. So strictly speaking, the Copernican model is false. He didn't have any strong opinions about whether the stars were all in one sphere, but he did argue that given the fact that the stars are probably not in the same spheres, and we move, and we're not in the center of the universe, right? This is important. If we're not in the center of the universe and we move, then the stars should shift relative to one another, not because they are truly moving, but because the way we're moving at different angles. So this is called parallax. If we're not in the center and we're moving around the sun, then the stars should seemingly change their relationships to one another, but they don't. They seem to stay relative to one another exactly where they are. And he uses this as an argument for how immensely large the universe must be, because we would not see that parallax only if the stars are incredibly far from us. So that's quite a clever use of his new theory. Last thing here is you might use this, look at this one. I'm not going to play the video, but just this one image from this video shows us quite well how in the Copernican model, suddenly this issue of retrograde motion is solved in a completely different way. So you can see here, here's Mars' orbit. It's moving in this direction in the ecliptic. The Earth is moving this direction in the ecliptic, right? But the Earth is moving faster. It's closer and it's moving faster than Mars. And so when you're on, you can see this is where we would, this arrow shows where we would see from our vantage point Mars. And as we pass Mars in our orbit, it's going to appear that Mars is moving backwards until we get past it. Once we get past it, it's still going to look like Mars is moving forward, right? So what happens in the Copernican model is that retrograde motion is no longer ascribed to the planets, but rather to the influence of the motion of the Earth itself. So the fundamental, Copernicus himself says that kind of the fundamental idea of the Copernican model is not heliocentrism. The fundamental idea is that the Earth moves, right? And that motion of the Earth is what is responsible for the apparent retrograde and irregular motions of the other planets. Copernicus didn't have a new physics. He didn't work in physics. He had no physical explanations for why the planets move as they do. Those are among none of his reasons as to why. In fact, whenever he uses a physical explanation or appeals to physics, he essentially uses Aristotelian physics, right? About natural places and things of that kind. We'll talk more in class about the effect of Copernicus, how this effectively puts the Earth out among the stars, and how this would also, but you can think about it for yourself, how this also, if this is the true model, completely changes the value system that people would have compared to the Aristotelian and the Christian models of the cosmos. The Earth is no longer in the crappy central region where all the heavy stuff accumulates, and is not in the only place where there is change. It is out among the stars. Thank you.